Hey everybody, Nathan King here with the Auburn Undercover podcast. Welcome into today's War Eagle Wakeup. We're going to talk a little bit about Auburn basketball. Reached a critical point of the offseason, really one that Bruce Pearl said today as we record this on Monday that is pretty chaotic, a lot more chaotic than it used to be because you're dealing with the transfer portal, guys exiting the portal, which closed only a week ago, and guys who are in the draft process, trying to get all those guys in the right place for summer workouts to begin here toward the end of May. For Auburn, they've got players in that situation, both in the transfer portal and in the draft process, both guys that are on their team currently and guys that they are looking at adding to the team. So we'll talk a little bit today about Bruce Pearl's comments. He spoke to reporters in Alexander City, his For the Children Golf Classic, an annual event fundraiser that he does every year. Caught up with him before the event. Started, of course, the big news over the weekend, substantial news when you look at Auburn's roster management for next year and kind of, where somebody might be trending in terms of whether he's going to be on the roster or whether he isn't, is Johni Broome, the All-SEC center, last season transferred over from Morehead State, ended up being Auburn's leading scorer and leading rebounder on the year. He's the only player in the SEC who finished the season top 5 in field goal percentage, rebounding, and blocks. He's, of course, one of the best big men in the league. He, along with Jalen Williams and Dylan Cardwell, you'll remember they all declared for the draft. Of course, if you have the opportunity to do that, that doesn't end up being a negative for most players because unlike the NFL, you can even hire an agent and you can go through the whole draft process. You can get feedback from the NBA in this case, and you can still return to school as long as you pull out of the draft at the right time, before the deadline, which in this case is May 31st for guys to pull out of the draft. Johni Broome got invited to the G League Elite Camp, which you'll remember Alan Flanagan. Last year, Auburn's had some guys go through it in the past. It's an opportunity for, really, the main goal is to get an NBA Combine invite. A lot of guys get NBA Combine invites straight out of college, straight after entering the draft. They don't have to go through any sort of middleman there. They just go straight to the Combine. If you're going to be a first-round pick, you're going to end up getting an invite to the Combine. But some guys got to work for it. Jared Harper did it in the past for Auburn. JT Thor did it in the past for Auburn. And then Johni Broome was one of 8 players called up from the G League camp to the NBA Combine. He shot almost 67% from the floor in a couple games, couple like exhibition, scrimmage-type games in the G League camp. He had 40 points across those 2 games, consistently viewed and rated by draft analysts and scouts who were there in Chicago for the G League camp as possibly being the best big man on the floor. And so while that's great for Johni Broome, and obviously he has an opportunity now to show what he's got at the NBA Combine, which runs all week. It started today with measurements on Monday in Chicago. It, of course, puts arguably Auburn's best returning player in the balance. His roster spot for next season is now hanging in the balance. It's a bit of a double-edged sword that Bruce Pearl's had to deal with over the years with a few different players. He said on Monday, quote, Johni definitely helped himself, clearly doing the things that he does. He's able to score, played physically, has high basketball IQ. The things he needs to continue to work on is defense, is rim protection, rebounding out of his area. We'll see that again. Of course, he's talking about in the Combine this week. Bruce Pearl did note, of course, the level of competition at the Combine will be higher than the G League camp, end quote. The question is, for Auburn, really, what happens in the nightmare scenario if Johni Broome doesn't come back? Well, Bruce Pearl, hit home the point today in Alexander City that he's done with so many of his draft prospects in the past, and that is that if you're not a first-round pick or a high second-round guy, meaning if you are not in the top 40, 45 picks, really, more like 35, 40 maybe, that are going to be pretty much shoe-ins to be on a roster spot in your rookie season, it's really hard to cut it. It's really hard to cut it, bouncing around roster spots, bouncing around the G League, as Bruce Pearl, brought up in terms of what's the percentage. We've been asked that on our board a few times. If somebody gets called up to the Combine, how often do those guys end up actually turning pro? Well, Bruce Pearl gave out a number. There are 8 guys called up this year. 7 guys were called up from the G League camp last year. None of those guys got drafted. I haven't gone and looked at every single one of those guys to see how many stayed in the draft. Of course, everybody's situation, it's not really an exact science. Everybody's situation is going to be different. But none of those guys got drafted. And basically what Bruce Pearl is saying right now, which is what he said throughout his Auburn tenure, that, Johni will get evaluated this week and he'll continue. This will be more concrete feedback for him, whereas the G League camp was all about getting this Combine invite. This is the place where JT Thor was told by the Hornets and, by probably a few other teams, hey, we're going to take you in the second round. Like if you are going to stay in the draft, we're going to take you in the second round. He talked about it after he got drafted that, there were a couple teams that promised him that they would take him if he was still on the board there. So it's kind of a no-brainer for him to stay in the draft. But, if Johni Broome is not a first-round pick or a high second-round pick, which the odds of him being either of those things is pretty low at this point, just because you don't see him on many draft boards, period. Projected as a top 60 player in terms of being projected to be drafted in either round. There's no reputable outlets really out there showing him as a draft prospect. Of course, that can change with a big combine performance, but in all likelihood, Bruce Pearl is going to encourage him to return to school. That's what he does with sort of fringe draft guys like Broome in the past. Pearl said on Monday, quote, "Our feelings have always sort of been, can you get yourself into that first round? If you can get yourself into that first round, you need to go. It's hard to climb out of the second round. Guys that go second round, they're not the general manager's first pick. They do the two-way contract, and they spend most of their time in the G League." So I think best case scenario for Johni Broome in terms of his draft stock would be having another good showing at the combine, do a lot of good testing, meet with NBA teams. I think the best case scenario for him is going to be, hey, we've got a late second round choice. We like you as a big guy. We might. I just don't see a scenario where someone's going to promise him a draft spot. Maybe, you never know. And if that ends up happening, it might be difficult for him to turn that down. But in all likelihood, this is going to be a scenario where he gets maybe a late second round draft grade, and he's going to come back and talk to Auburn staff before the May 31st deadline. They're going to tell him, look, we think you should come back to school. We think another year, you'll go higher in the draft. You could maybe be a first round pick next year because you're going to be one of the best returning big guys in the league. And obviously, Auburn's got the advantage now of NIL, having an opportunity to sort of counter those second round contracts with whatever money they have available in their NIL funding. So that's what Bruce said today, pretty much in not so many words, that they will probably be encouraging him to come back to school, but it's still worth monitoring this week because, again, if you'll remember a couple years ago, it was pretty obvious over the course of the week in Chicago, JT Thor is going to stay in the draft because it started becoming obvious. He's one of the most athletic guys there. He's only 18 years old, has a ton of upside. Somebody is going to use a second round pick on him. And if a second round pick is good enough for Johni Broome, then he's going to end up staying in the draft. And so certainly something to watch as the waiting game now starts for Auburn and Bruce Pearl this week, really all the way up until that May 31st deadline. We talked about earlier what happens if he doesn't come back. As expected, Bruce Pearl said today that they're kicking the tires on some transfers. You I don't know how much of a quality big man, like an all-conference big man, like Johni Broome, you could get in the transfer portal at this point, but you need to at least keep your options open. We saw that kind of earlier in the portal. They hosted the Clemson transfer. They went after Micah Handlegolden, who ended up at Florida, the transfer from Marshall. They wanted to host him on a visit. He ended up committing to Florida before that. So they were already, kind of checking out a couple big men as soon as Johni entered the draft process, knowing that this was something that they were going to have to account for, knowing this is something, hey, down the line, we need to make sure we're not caught on our heels if Johni Broome does end up going to the draft. So Bruce Pearl said about that today, quote, "We're involved with some guys that are kind of waiting to see what he does," talking about Broome. "I don't know if they'll be as good as Johni because obviously Johni had a terrific year and next year he could have an even better year." So they are kind of kicking some tires on some transfer players. So we'll see. It'll be worth tracking what happens with Johni Broome, of course, this week at the Combine in Chicago. The other kind of newsy point thing, something we definitely wanted to talk to Bruce Pearl about today was their continued transfer recruitment at that 3 spot. Of course, Alan Flanagan announced he's entering the transfer portal last week as a grad transfer. A lot of people seem to assume, obviously, he's going to, he might end up with his dad at Ole Miss, Wes Flanagan, who went to join Chris Beard's staff earlier this offseason at Ole Miss. Bruce Pearl said today, quote, "We've been exploring those options on the wing for a while." Obviously talking about, players at that 3 spot. "We've been patient and we've lost a few guys we've been involved with. I say there are 3 or 4 guys that are still out there that we are actively involved with. We'd like to get one of them. If we got one of them, we'd feel really, really good about that position." End quote. A bunch of names that come to mind are a couple guys that, or actually one guy right now that is definitely on the clock. And that's Tyron Lawrence, the Vanderbilt transfer. He visited Auburn at the end of April. Hasn't taken any other public college visits. Obviously, you never know what happens, behind closed doors. Visits that don't get as publicized. But he had great things to say about Auburn. Auburn felt like they were in a good spot. They still do feel like they're in a good spot with him. Vanderbilt's leading scorer last year, 36% 3-point shooter. He got invited to the G League camp, and so people were kind of wondering, oh no, is Auburn going to have to compete against the draft? He did not get called up to the combine. So in all likelihood, he'll be returning to college. We're told that Vanderbilt is putting a press on him to possibly return to school. Jerry Stackhouse and his staff there at Vandy to possibly get him back for next season. You've seen a school like Georgia thrown around for him, but they filled up their roster. They don't have any more scholarship spots, so that doesn't really seem like it's picked up much traction at all. Florida, Texas Tech, those have been kind of thrown out. But at the end of the day, when you look at, what is the most concrete college opportunity for him, right now that has gained the most traction, that you've seen the most buzz out of, the one that you can actually put your finger on and not just say, oh, it's based off of rumors or whatever, is Auburn, because he did take that visit to Auburn. We know that he is Auburn's number one target right now. Of course, they lost out on a couple other targets. Matthew Cleveland was Florida State's leading scorer. He ended up going to Miami. Jalen Tyson was a really good three-point shooter, really good defender from Texas Tech, where, of course, Corey Williams, Auburn's new assistant, comes over from that Texas Tech staff. So they're hoping to kind of parlay that relationship there. He ends up going to Cal. He didn't end up coming to Auburn for a visit like they expected him to. So really, Tyron Lawrence is the biggest name right now. And I say he's on the clock because he's probably going to come to a decision here pretty soon. I would imagine he pulls out of the draft process before long. Of course, there's not a huge deadline on when you have to make a transfer commitment, but I think Auburn fans definitely need to be paying attention to what he does, because Bruce Pearl said, they've got a bunch of options. He said, like he said, there's 3 or 4 guys they've been keeping an eye on. He said, we don't want to settle. He said, we don't want somebody who, is not going to take us where we want to be, because he knows how important this position is. These are obviously the 2 biggest, talking about the wing spot and then talking about getting Broome back at that 5 spot. Those are the 2 biggest positions right now for this team, for Bruce Pearl and his staff to identify in the offseason. The other name that came up a few days ago, Julian Phillips. Auburn fans will remember him. 5-star. It really seemed like Auburn had a good opportunity to land him. He got released from his LSU letter of intent last year after Will Wade got fired. Auburn brought him in on a visit. All signs seem to be pointing that way. And then Tennessee swoops in at the last minute and is able to sort of seal the deal there. And they bring him in. He played 1 year at Tennessee. He was a good player, really good defensive player, really athletic, obviously, former top 15 overall player. He is in the draft process right now. He's at the combine with Johni Broome, much better of a draft prospect, guy who maybe he's a bona fide draft pick for sure. It's just a matter of whether he's going to work his way into the first round. And so that'll be something to monitor, whether he pulls out of the draft process or whether he tests off the charts or tests well, which he's expected to do. And, people are saying after this week, he's probably a first round guy. Don't think you'll be looking at him returning to college. But if he does return to college, I would expect Auburn to be a huge player for him there. Of course, you remember Walker Kessler a few years ago, that high school relationship paid off for a player who went to another school for 1 year, said, not really for me. That's not apples to apples. Obviously, that's not a super comparable situation for Kessler and Julian Phillips, because Phillips has an opportunity to be a draft prospect. But you've got to think Auburn feels good if he does end up pulling out of the draft and saying, I want to come back to college. There's that existing relationship. There is a huge need at that 3 spot. And I thought it was interesting. Bruce said today, he sort of made his pitch. He said, I don't really know why we're losing out on these guys, because it's such a great opportunity to play that position on our team next year. He said, I quote, I don't see truly why we're losing anybody. If there's a wing out there that likes to score and play with a little bit of freedom. Wendell Green and Flanagan were our 2 most ball-dominant players, and they're both gone. Placed Wendell with Aiden Holloway, and Al played a major role, had a great run, particularly in the second half of the year. You'd like to think that a great wing, and he said, I say wing, but we play 3 guards anyway, would be pretty excited about the opportunity. And then he said, we've felt good about a lot of them, but he said, quote, we haven't had anybody say the magic words yet. So, he's pretty on point with what we thought we had known about the transfer recruitments of a guy like a Tyron Lawrence. They felt really good about Matthew Cleveland, and then things sort of went quiet for a couple weeks. Miami emerges as the front runner for him. So those are obviously the 2 biggest roster storylines for Auburn heading into the rest of the offseason. And I think there's a decent chance this could be a big week for both of those. Number one, because you got to monitor what happens with Broome, whether he, for some reason, continues to emerge and ends up being a guy who wants to stay in the NBA draft if he continues to raise his stock, and is a guy like Tyron Lawrence now on the clock for Auburn. Certainly something to monitor this week. So just wanted to sort of unload the notebook there from our meeting with Bruce Pearl in Alexander City today. If you guys want to go to auburnundercover.com, we've got all that stuff in written form. Be a couple more stories about things I didn't touch on too deep. Talked a little bit about Aiden Holloway coming in this summer. Talked a little bit about roster management in general in the modern era of transfer portal and NIL, and kind of dealing with this new calendar this time of year. So go head on over to auburnundercover.com and be sure to check that out. So I'm Nathan King. Thank you guys so much for joining me today on the War Eagle Wake Up. We'll talk to you guys soon.